You're listening to Think About It with Pastor Peter Karblis.
Welcome to today's episode of Think About It with Pastor Peter Karblis. Peter, welcome back to the microphone.
As always, Rick, it's great to be here.
So we've been digging deep in the last few episodes into right and wrong, good and evil. Where I want us to launch into today is many people will say a lot of things that the traditional Christian view take of good, evil, right, wrong is based on culture rather than absolute. You'll often hear examples like, oh, well, if we still followed all the law of the Old Testament, we wouldn't wear fabric of mixed thread, and we wouldn't, women would have to have their heads covered. And so there's sort of somewhere in there, we've got to define a difference between what were cultural, ceremonial kind of laws, not eating the animal, eating meat of a pig, which now we would say is fine. So how do we, and we can talk about how the context of this, but how do we make those decisions now as 21st century Christians, where we're reading stuff both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and say, well, that applied then but was really more a cultural thing, whereas this one actually is absolute and stands for today?
I think, first of all, in approaching those questions, and they're very important, we've got to understand that when people throw those things at us, there are those who come, let's say, with different levels of sincerity.
Absolutely.
Some are trying to play gotcha.
Yeah, definitely.
And others are asking genuine questions. And if the questioner is sincere, then we can enter into dialogue. If the person is playing gotcha, then it's a matter of who is the smartest Alec on the day as to who appears to win, an interaction that only furthers to increased division and ill will. But let's suppose the person's sincere and says, well, why is that? I think there's a reality that as human beings we're social, so a lot of the things we do are socially constructed. For example, when I say hello to you, and if I say the word hello, in English, that's English. If I'm Spanish, I'll say hola. So the fact that I'll say hello and you recognise what hello is, that's a social construct, right? The Spanish person will say hola. And so when you look at that, yeah, they're social constructs, but they're actually important because what's common between them is that human beings socially, because we're social animals, need socially constructed ways by which we can achieve the ability to express either goodwill or ill intent to each other. It's interesting that just as we were coming here today, I was listening to a conversation on ABC radio from a professor of primatology about how chimpanzees communicate with their hands, and they're realising that even in other species there are ways of communicating that are quote-unquote socially constructed. And they're trying to work out what's objective and what's not. So the first thing we've got to realise is that in nearly everything we do, there are things that are socially constructed, but often those social constructs are ways of expressing or engaging with things that are objectively real. So we constantly have, to use more technical words, a subjective expression or a subjective agreement even on how we will address objective issues. And so for some to say everything is subjective is only partly true, because everything probably does contain some element of subjective perception. But then subjective perception isn't everything, because there are things that are actually objectively exist. For example, this table I'm touching is there and does not depend upon my understanding to be there. If I close my eyes, that table is still there, right? But my perception of the table, my value of the table, my understanding of the colour of whiteness it has, and whether I like it or dislike it, that's all subjective. So everything we have contains these two elements. But if we're going to play gotcha, we can tie knots in each other on almost anything, right? But if we're sincere, then we can start to deal with these kind of distinctions.
Yeah, so we obviously go back to the original, as we were sort of talking off air about the Ten Commandments, which is really the only things that we have that in our belief and understanding and tradition were written by God, engraved on the tablet. Everything else was sort of, to an extent, interpreted through man. And this is where you end up with the 633 laws or whatever the Pharisees had by the time of Jesus, that these are sort of other stuff. But they're all going to have some degree of cultural construct built into them. But if we go back to the 10, then we could say they are absolute.
Yes, and I can imagine people saying, well, why do you have the 10 Commandments? Other belief systems don't have them. That's true. Now, within the Christian belief system, if we start and we say, okay, the 10 Commandments in the Bible, as the Bible is written, indicate that it is the only part of the Bible written by God himself, which is really quite an amazing statement. The sources from which the books of Genesis through to Deuteronomy were written, traditionally written by Moses. Whether he actually wrote it all or not, we don't know. But it was people who wrote those things on whatever there was the writing instrument, the papyrus or the bones or whatever they wrote things on in those days. But the thing is that the 10 Commandments, Scripture says, were written by the finger of God into the tablets of stone that Moses first brought down from the mountain. So that really indicates how seriously important those 10 precepts are. But those 10 precepts are not written like laws. They're not written like, if you do this, then there is this penalty. They're not written how we construct laws today. We often call them commandments or laws, shorthand, but don't realise how, in many ways, there are statements of what constitutes wise living, right? That wise people do not kill, wise people do not commit adultery, wise people do not steal, for example. Wise people don't have a real understanding of the nature of the God of the universe. Wise people don't take the name of that God in vain. Wise people respect sacred time and hence the Sabbath. Wise people honour their parents, mother and father. So when you look at it that way in terms of precepts of wisdom, that's important. But then is wisdom optional? Wisdom's not optional, because if we don't live wise lives, then we live in ways that are destructive and often produce death.
It has consequences.
Has terrible consequences and sometimes require sanctions. If I live unwisely, I can put your health and life at risk, and therefore you may have to act against me in order to prevent my lack of wisdom from affecting you. So the 10 Commandments are written more in that kind of a genre of 10 very important statements of non-optional wisdom, and then we have the task of working out how to live and express that wisdom in life as we find it.
And when Jesus said the summary of the law is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself, really all the 10 Commandments, 10 precepts fit into those two statements.
Yeah, exactly. And if you keep working on the lens of wisdom that I'm using, Jesus is basically saying, look, the truly wise person loves God with all their heart, soul, mind and strength, and loves their neighbour as themselves.
If you do that, life will work well.
Life will work well. And then the question is, well, okay, flesh that out. How do I do that in practical life? He said, well, basically, it's got 10 contours. And the 10 contours are what we call the 10 Commandments, and they're the contours of love. So, for example, love involves honouring and respecting your mother and your father. And at the times that was giving, that had to do with aged care. Loving meant that you cared for your parents as they aged. Loving meant you cared for your children as they grew. And if you did not care for your parents as they aged, and you did not care for their children as they grew, then how can you claim to be loving God with your whole soul, mind and strength, whole heart, mind and strength, and loving your neighbour as yourself if you're not doing that to your parents? Love also involves not killing, being kind.
So that brings us to an example, and we talked about this off air a moment ago, about there was I don't know if you term it a law or a guideline or whatever in Old Testament, and certainly presented as a law. If a woman's husband died, then it's the husband's brother's responsibility to marry that woman and to produce children.
Yes.
Now, we would look at that now in our 21st century and say, that's abhorrent. That's a ridiculous thing. How could that be law? How could that be God? But again, you had to be conscious of and this is what we talked about, the context of the day. We didn't have social welfare. We didn't have all the constructs around a woman that exists now if she's left widowed.
Yes. And it's interesting because the recent archaeological, theological, sociological research into this area has come to see how and that's called the law of the levirate marriage, right, which is one of the things that scorners of the Old Testament love to point to and say how silly it was. Recent research has come to understand really how caring that actually was, because the way that people survived in those days, and a lot of societies, agrarian society these days, remain the same. And that is that the people who were, let's say, of childbearing age in the prime of their life, they were doing the work that provided the sustenance, right? They were raising the children, and they were caring for their parents as they had got older and were no longer able to do it. And you needed to have sufficient of those people around in order for there to be sufficient children coming in so that there would be parents being cared for at the end. So if you like, there was an entire life cycle. And I hate the way I'm saying this because it sounds terribly mechanical and utilitarian, but
it's practical.
Within the limits of a conversation, that's the best we can say. So that back in those days, if a woman who depended upon her husband to provide for her lost her husband and she had no children, that meant that she was destined for an old age of destitution. And part of the reason for the levirate marriage was so that she would still be able to have the children who in their adult lives would care for her as she grew older.
So, I mean, that's clearly an example where what was a law has in some ways been superseded. It's not needed now because the society structure is such that the society's almost doing that. I mean, I think still the ideal is that the family looks after each other and that, we do look after the older members and there's, a broader, expanded family. But are we saying, therefore, that there are laws that are no longer relevant because of the culture?
I generally say the value underlying the law remains relevant. If we see that all of these 600-odd laws of the Old Testament were themselves extensions, if you like, unpacking of how the 10 precepts of the 10 Commandments or the 10 precepts of wisdom were to be applied in their lives, you can see that they're applied to a society that is so different from ours today, it's difficult to see the relevance. Now, our little chat then about the levirate law is a good illustration of how counterintuitive this thing, which at first appears repugnant to us, in fact makes a kind of a sense. But the funny thing is, as I was saying to you before we were on air, as I even listened to myself talk about that, there are aspects of harshness in that I still find difficult to deal with, right? But at the same time, you can see within it the wisdom of this incredible goodwill of loving the widow as we would love others, to allow her to be able to have the family, the children who love her, who are going to nurture her emotionally as well as physically as she goes through the stages of her life. And those children will themselves not just be used by her, but will be loved by her and have a mother that they value.
So where do we draw a line between that kind of a law against something where we read a law that prohibits astrology, let's say, and we can see that in scriptures, it teaches against that? Is it not then relevant for someone today to say, well, in our current culture, that's okay, we can handle that. We can handle astrology and dabbling in that stuff because culturally we're in some ways more developed and superior to that, in the era that was written?
I've got three answers to that. First of all, whether or not belief in modern astrology is somehow or other superior to what was before, because I kind of find it difficult to believe my life is controlled by the movement of stars in the sky. So that seems to me to be more the maintenance of irrational superstition. The second thing is, you spoke about the word principle, right, which is fascinating, and you also spoke about the idea of where do you draw a line. Okay, now what I'll ask the listeners to do is to play parts of the body with me. And Rick, as you can see, I'm holding up my hand.
Yep.
Okay, and I've shown
Let
you
me
this
vouch
before.
for that. I can see that.
I like this. And to play parts of the body, I'll ask all the listeners to point to the palm of your hand. And we'll point there.
Yep.
All right? Point to the wrist. It's there.
Yep.
Now, the palm is in the centre of the hand, the wrist is below. We know that. Now, I want you to show me to the last fraction of a millimetre where the hand stops and the wrist starts. Now, are we confused about the reality of the wrist or the hand? No, we're not. We know that. No problem at all. It's very basic. But if you take a look at it, there's actually no precise point at which the hand stops and the wrist starts, because they are points of focus in a continuum. And so many of these issues about where do we draw the line between what is old and what is new, the problem is because we're looking for a boundary. Whereas when I say where is the hand, you don't look at the boundary between the two. In fact, you even don't notice it. You look at the centre of the palm. I say where is the hand, you look at the part of the wrist probably just sort of between the two bones at the bottom of the wrist. The point is we think in terms of looking for these boundaries and these legal lines where they really don't exist. And so what we've got to be constantly looking for, what are the core values that are being expressed? And if in the application and expression of those values, are we producing things that are functional and consistent with the wisdom of those precepts, then that's how we start to draw our distinctions. And by seeing how they were applied in the context of the ancient culture of the scriptures, that helps us understand ways that it can be done.
Okay, let me then draw a couple of other examples, I guess, that we can say. And these are things that, when you are confronted by someone who wants to tear down, say, the Christian belief system or our belief in the Bible and our reliance on 10 Commandments and that kind of thing, they'll draw out things like, but there's laws about not eating certain kinds of foods, and there's laws about not having mixed fabrics and this sort of thing. Some will say, well, didn't Jesus deal with all that stuff? And, the words to Peter, don't call unclean what I call clean, all those things that happened in the first chapters of the New Testament. Did that tear away a lot of the law? Or did it, Jesus himself said, I don't come to remove the law, but to fulfill the law.
Okay, now what you're looking at here is the concept of cultural expression.
Yeah.
If you go back into the ancient societies, the deepest thing that they had was a sense of order, all right, and that you didn't say and do or do certain practices that represented disorder, all right, and this could be another big conversation about the constant fear they had of the problem of chaos versus the order in order to be able to survive. So things needed to have a kind of order in order to survive. And in doing that, all human societies have cultural ways of expressing what they consider to be the essential order in the way we live. Now, let's take, for example, if I were to raise my right arm and hold my arm rigid and straight in front of my body at an angle of 45 degrees, and I do that with a defiant look on my face inside of a crowd, these days I will be arrested because of what that represents, because that represents social disorder. It's called a Nazi salute, right? So is it wrong for me to put my arm in front of me and raise it to 45 degrees and shout? Well, the action itself is immaterial. It's what the action represents that matters. And in the same way, a lot of these things in the Old Testament, it was what these things represented culturally, and they were the cultural statement that people were making. Now, for example, if I say the word his or her, them or they, or use pronouns these days, is it wrong to say his or her? Or should I always say them? Is it hate speech to say those things? So you can see we have cultural constructs coming upon us today that are making things that are only right or wrong or necessary or not necessary because of the context of our culture. And those things were right and wrong within the context of their culture. So the issue about whether you had fabric of mixed thread wasn't really because they were prejudiced against certain textiles, but within the context of that, where everything was understood spiritually. There may have been, for example, the god of cotton and the god of wool, and that somehow or other the way you did it was doing something that had a kind of religious symbolism that we're not aware of. And it was that symbolism that was being objected to.
Okay, I think we'll have to wrap this one up here now, but it will lead into our next conversation, which I'd like us to talk about. How do we live in this tension? How do we have conversations with people who disagree but keep a level of respect and kindness, if you like, in that whole dialogue? Because it seems to be something that our world is really struggling with at the moment.
Yeah, I'll look forward to that conversation, Rick, and that is another big one.
It is a big one. Thank you, Peter.
Think About It with Pastor Peter Karblas is a production of Rema.cc.